You're listening to the Hayek Program podcast. This podcast includes audio from lectures, interviews, and discussions from scholars and visitors of the F.A. Hayek Program for Advanced Study in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. To learn more about the Hayek Program, visit hayek.mercatus.org. To learn about graduate student fellowship opportunities with the Mercatus Center at George Mason University for students at Mason as well as at universities across the globe, please visit students.mercatus.org.
Today is Tuesday, November 17th, 2020, and I'm here with Professor Erwin Dekker of Erasmus University in Rotterdam. Erwin, thanks for coming on.
Great to be here, Pete.
All right, let's just dive right into it. You went to the LSE and studied philosophy of science, or you worked with Mary Morgan and others, and then you ended up by doing a thesis on the intellectual history of the Austrian school. But you've had a long interest in the interactions of art and culture, and I was wondering if you could discuss how you adjudicate between these various interests and your work that's more strictly economics per se.
So indeed, I went to London, and London was a strange experience because I basically came into an analytical tradition of philosophy of science. The department was started by Karl Popper, and that continued until this day. And Nancy Cartwright was there, and she really has a sort of analytical philosophy approach to the philosophy of science. So they were trying to make sense of realism and the use of models in economics. I wasn't really there at home, but I learned a whole lot in London, especially about arts and culture. So it sort of, in a weird way, put me on the track that I'm currently on, but not in the way that it was this program that I went to, and then that put me on the path, but more so the surroundings there. I remember being particularly struck that one day I walked into the Tate Modern, which is the biggest contemporary art museum they have in London, and then one of the paintings of Mondrian was described as being about the search for a dynamic equilibrium. Now, this might sound a little bit odd because, as you know, the Mondrian painting is just straight lines. So what was dynamic about that? There is the later work inspired by New York and by jazz music, which is arguably a lot more dynamic. But they used similar terms. And then back in the Netherlands, when after a while I came into contact with Arjo Klamer, and he had many of these similar interests, and he I'm still not sure how to think about it in hindsight, because perhaps he set me up for failure. But he said I had this project in the early 90s to demonstrate that a similar major shift occurred in the sciences as it did in art. Now, in art, we know that there's a modernist moment, right? This is associated in literature with James Joyce. It's associated with Stravinsky and the modern classical music, and in architecture with the sort of purely functionalist architecture that we know of, and modern skyscrapers and the like. And he said there's something similar happened in economics. And I was very much taken by this idea. In the background, still this Mondrian painting. And then he said, don't you think that a supply and demand diagram is just a Mondrian painting, but then with economic meaning? And I thought, yeah, this is it. So I pursued this project for a while, I think 2 years or so, but it remained very associative. So it remained very much a sort of personal fascination that was hard to communicate to others, because you're seeing links, and there is in fact quite a considerable literature on how modern natural sciences, especially physics, overlaps with the development of cubism and new ways of thinking about time and space. But it remained very hard to put that into writing, and especially to convince others that my interpretation was plausible or the one correct one. So over time, that I started developing that into places. And so we had identified, I think at the time, 3 different places where modernists in arts and culture overlapped with modernists in economics, if there, of course, is such a thing. The most obvious candidate was Keynes in Bloomsbury, right? So Keynes was part of an artistic circle known as the Bloomsbury Group, perhaps most famous for Virginia Woolf and her psychological novels. And of course, in Keynes, you have an emphasis on the sort of psychological workings of the mind and animal spirits. And so there were similar explorations, and London at the time was anyhow a very interesting place, as you know. The LSE was also, lots of things were happening in the 1930s. So that seemed to be a promising place. And then there was Chicago in the 1960s. It was a little bit late, but modernism takes long, and there's in the literature on modernism the idea of late modernism. So there are famous architects in Chicago. So there was a sort of sense that, okay, something might have happened there. And then there was Vienna for the early modernism. And I ended up writing my dissertation about Vienna. And in that dissertation, I really tried to show that similar cultural tensions, I think that this is the word, so that became central for me. Initially, it was much more sort of looking for similarities, but I don't think that looking for similarities is the right way to go when you do this sort of thing. It's rather that a culture or a society today or back then sets a certain problem set, there are certain tensions in that culture, and intellectuals in any discipline respond to that. And they do so in different ways, but the responses might have some similarities, but it's not all one response. So we shouldn't think of Vienna as one place where one thing happened. No, instead, it was a place full of tensions in which different things happened. I think other authors have demonstrated that even better than me, and in some sense you could say that the anti-Semitic politics that Hitler later popularized was already pioneered also in Vienna, right? So there's not only the stuff that we now remember, but there were also a more ugly side, but that arose from the fact that there was lots of tension over there. And so I tried to elaborate how those similar tensions motivated the people in the arts and motivated people in economics. And I don't want to repeat that entire thesis, but the major struggle they had was the Habsburg Empire, which was a loose unification of various cultures and peoples who were at the time emancipating themselves, discovering national awareness, national identities, and that clashed with the sort of overarching, somewhat liberal, but not liberal in a sort of comprehensive sense, but more liberal in the sense of live and let live. So a loose confederation, you might say, how that system came under intense pressure from the development of all these different groups that were trying to emancipate themselves, trying to get more autonomy. And so everybody was struggling with this as the central tension, which many feared would lead to the decline of the Habsburg civilization. Right. And so they tried to find new responses to that crucial question at the time.
In my interview with Stefan Koloff, who's a co-author and collaborator with you on the German Historical School, he made a very interesting observation related to that with regard to Germany, which is that the reason why the British classical economists, by the time we're talking about late 19th, early 20th century, they treat the institutions as fixed and given because they've already evolved and been there, and there's not a transition in some sense going on. They were the first movers. So where he says in the German, his view of the Germans is that they really weren't historicists as much as they were like what we would call modern institutionalists, ordo-liberals in some sense, because the institutions were in fact what was emerging. And so therefore that's what they were studying, how the framework comes to be formed. And they didn't think that you could then treat the institutions as fixed and govern and then study the behavior within institutions per se. Do you find that persuasive to you in this interaction, especially given your knowledge of the Austrians and their side of that debate?
But I agree. But the story between Austria and Germany is really quite different in the sense that Germany was the ascending power and the Habsburg Empire was the descending, or the power in decline. And so it was an empire, right? And empires were on the way out, whether that was the Ottoman Empire or the Russian Empire or the Habsburg Empire. So they were on the way out. So they saw a structure, an institutional structure that they to to a large extent cherished very much, although there was internal critique, right? In the book I detail how Menger is best read as a sort of imminent critique of the Habsburg Empire, but later authors really worried that this Habsburg Empire, these sort of framework that they had taken for granted, was about to disappear. So they sought to fortify it or reinvent it so that it would be sustainable into the 20th century. And that's, I think, different because the German historical school really saw itself sort of riding the wave of history,
right?
In the sense, so it was perfecting something that was emerging,
right?
Which is very different than that you're defending something that's in danger of getting lost.
Yeah, I mean, it's having these conversations with you and Stefan put a lot of things in new light for me. So I'm fascinated by it.
Can I add one thing on this point? I want to highlight this one point, which we accept for all philosophers and all people in the humanities, or all intellectuals in the humanities, and that is that they're in part products of their time, right?
Yeah.
And there's a sense when we say that economics is a science, that what we're doing is we're putting the economists outside of this dynamic. So we're making them atemporal thinkers. And right, part of what I try to do really in my dissertation is to say, no, they were. I want to argue that they were humanist intellectuals anyhow, and not everybody's going to be convinced. And they also wrote a lot of fascinating technical economics. So there's no point in denying that. But I do want to argue that whatever they produced had cultural significance, right, for them. And so it was motivated by the cultural concerns of their time. They weren't shaped by it in any sort of deterministic sense, but they were responding just as the major philosophers that we now think of were always responding to the challenges of their age.
Yeah, as you know, I mean, I'm a big advocate of ideas in context for doing intellectual history. But I also view intellectual history as a tool for theorizing. And my savior in this is Kenneth Boulding, because he has this idea of the extended present. But if you ask me, can I understand, Karl Menger or Böhm-Bawerk or Wieser or Mises or Hayek or whatever, you have to basically contextualize all of their arguments in their time. But then if I want to theorize about my time and I want to draw on them, how do I negotiate that? And so, like someone like Skinner or Pocock might argue that I'm not allowed to do that kind of temporal, time hopping or whatever. Yeah. But so it makes me weird in the history of economic thought community, because especially in recent years, history of economic thought has become the history of economics, which is trying to make the argument that you're doing, and a lot of work on that. And my concern in that field is not that work is invaluable. It's immensely valuable. It's the real nature of intellectual history work, I think. But it's that the history of doctrine matters too, right? And so the fact that, in my opinion, Marx made logical errors, as highlighted by Böhm-Bawerk, that isn't just a 1880s exposure of the logical flaws in Marx. It's as relevant today, until they figure out a way to fix the transformation problem. Then, the fundamental critique that follows out doesn't work, right? And it doesn't matter whether or not people try to resurrect it, Anwar Sheikh or whoever tries to resurrect it today without fixing the problem that Böhm-Bawerk identified. And so that crosses across time. But I no doubt that, think about Mises's socialist calculation argument, right? It's in the context. The reason why now we can reconstruct, and we see it's not so unique to Mises, that Weber understood it, that Wieser has hints of it, all these kind of things like that, is because it was all in the air, right? It was all, everyone was, it's kind of like today, people are bouncing around saying all these kind of ideas again. And it's like, okay, how can I not pay attention to it in some sense?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I was motivated by the times too, right? I think it's now even more visible, but we have liberalism in decline at the moment. And that was a theme that I wanted to connect across time. So, right, there was basically a liberal progressive movement that sought to perfect liberalism, that for me is the moment I came of age. That was the 1990s, where liberalism was on the ascent, and there was a feeling of perfectionism, and all of a sudden that world somehow collapsed, and the very groups that I think liberals felt that they were speaking up for sort of started turning against liberalism. And so this is also very much how I read, at least initially, the Habsburg Empire story, is that they were slowly trying to develop a liberal society, and it was incrementalist, and it was certainly not always revolutionary, but it was incrementalist and progressive. And then these mass movements turned against them, and they really struggle to respond.
Yeah, I mean, it's also, there was again a sense of euphoria that then gets met with frustration, and that of course excites our imagination to try to explain what went wrong or whatever, and whatnot. That gets me to my next question I wanted to ask you about, which is not really, it's more about the arguments that are coming out of your shop in some sense, and in this case identified with Ario Klammer's book, Doing the Right Thing. And I know you've interviewed him for that, and people can talk about that, but just one of the things that has struck me in the discussion of what you were just talking about, which is the critique of neoliberalism, is the elasticity of the definition of neoliberalism. So as someone who actually, I guess exists inside of all of that conversation, one of the things that I found so alienating is that I don't recognize myself inside of it. Part of it is because my understanding of neoliberalism actually is how I read Ario's book, which is the unrelenting application of neoclassical economics into realms of activity outside of the market, including to improve government, to do all these kind of different things. And so it's how can I get efficient, and I forget the other kind of norms that are being called upon in these services. And so I wonder, how you see this playing out methodologically, analytically, and ideologically. I mean, I don't want to run away from that idea in the debates of the 20th and now the 21st century.
Yeah. So I think there's two things in Ario's book that I think are sort of key ideas, I think also that motivate my own work, although I don't go with him all the way to the ethical side. Sure. He has a father who was a televangelist, I think, who far before the term existed. So he was the most famous preacher on Sunday mornings on national radio, and so I think he has more of that the sort of ethical background. But there's two things in his work that I find of great value. I think one is what some anthropologists call social provisioning of goods. So he has an enormous awareness of the fact that most goods can be provided for in many different institutional forms. So I'm sure that since they're being taught by you, you've already discussed Ostrom and notions of self-governance. Ario adds to that the family. Now, this is in part motivated by the field in which we both do a lot of practical research and teaching, is that the field of the economics of the arts. And it's just simply true that a little bit like for startups, most of the finance actually comes from within the family or the close circle of friends. So the social provisioning there actually enabling your partner or your child to be an artist or to become an artist before they get on a professional path all takes place within family or very small circles. So he calls it the oikos. And then there's social provisioning from the state. Right, and that will also bring us into ideology. But just as an empirical observation, it's important to see that a lot of things are socially provided for by the state. So I always have this discussion with my students who always say museums are a public good. And for the first 5 years, I always tried to hammer it out of them and said, no, just look at the characteristics. People buy a ticket, and museums can get congested. There's rivalry, there's excludability. There's no way that museums are a public good. But of course, in some real sense, they are very, it is very true, at least for the European context, not always for the American context. Although the way you give tax benefits to private donors has of course some element of public provisioning. But museums are, in a very real sense, in most European countries, publicly provided. So in that sense, they are public goods. So I think that's the one element. That's this social provisioning, and that can take place in many things. Then I think the other thing that Arjo says, and you and I read him differently from how he reads himself, because but is that the most important things that we seek to realize with goods that we buy on the market actually take place in social circles, where we share things with our friends. So we buy books on the markets, but we use them as inputs for creating stimulating intellectual conversations. We buy food at Walmart, but then we take it home and we turn it into family dinners and family parties, right? We buy drinks and so on. You can continue on and on. And so Arjo says the real important thing is not the transaction that takes place on the market, but the actual production, right? And yeah, there are some papers by Gary Becker and Stigler, and I think his early co-author was Michael, I don't know. I don't know him as well, but they argued that, of course, there's a household production function. So it can be reconciled, I think, with that way of thinking. And it's actually, for me, tempting to read it that way, because that way it makes it compatible with modern economics. But even so, I don't think the Becker paper actually highlights how important this very fact is, that the things we create within social circles, so from clubs, churches, sports, and so on, we all do that with inputs bought on the market, but the activities or the things that we really care about are ultimately produced by inputs of time and skills that human beings develop and that don't happen within either the firm or within market transactions. So he wants us to focus away from, also in a real sense, and I think we can talk about that later more, is where the value is created.
Yeah.
So a lot of the way that economists measure the value being created is the amount of transactions that takes place on the market. And he says, no, the value is being created in the activities, in the sports club, at the dinner table. So it's a poor measurement to say how much was the bill at the restaurant. You should ask, how much did the people enjoy it, sitting around and spending the evening together and having good conversations? Yeah. So he would say that's where the value is, not in the bill.
Yeah, that's and our effort to reduce that down to the cost minimization misses out on that aspect, and therefore cheapens our social experiences with each other.
Yeah, and in some sense, he of course moved away considerably, I think, also in his writing style, sometimes from economics. So I think there's still trade-offs, right? Because no matter where you think that the value is created, you got to ask, where is the most value created? What friend do I spend most time with? How do I divide time between family and work, right? But even in work, it would change a little bit how you think that the benefits being generated differ, because you turn work into a meaningful activity. At least he very often does. So it's not an instrumental activity merely, but also a sort of thing we pursue for its own sake. So that's there. The trade-offs are still there, but the costs are not as easy, I think, to pin down. Yeah. And particularly time. Perhaps we have a poor understanding of time as a cost, or also, and yeah, this is another thing that we might want to highlight, is that sometimes I'm not sure whether it captures quite what is going on. So we study the arts, and so people spend the night at the theater. If you do the opportunity cost reasoning for that, it's actually very, very expensive, because the people at the theater are all high earners. We know that they skew toward the highly educated and the highly earning. So we want to say that that's sort of 3-4 hours that they spend doing that theater stuff. So to sort of justify that as a rational choice, the benefits must be rather enormous.
Right.
Otherwise, that activity doesn't make any sort of sense. Now, it could be that something that Zellinger says is true is that these are sort of separate domains. And so the trade-offs don't quite work across the domains. Now, of course, modeling that is tricky, but I do always find that at least somewhat plausible. And but again, that might be culturally dependent. But simply working evening hours in some Western European countries is not always an option and is socially frowned upon. So the major cost might be that you're not spending the time with your family. And if you're spending the time with your family anyhow, you might as well make it enjoyable by going to the theater or the museum together.
Yeah.
So that it's kind of, sealed off. I don't know how you would capture that.
Yeah, I mean, the one thing about Klammer's work in general, and I mean, I think this is fascinating, is that in a large part, besides his conceptual examination of things, which is, been always very insightful or whatever, he's kind of walked the walk himself, like he tried to create, a learning environment in which people learn for the sake of learning, and take the time and view that as learning for life rather than learning for an occupation. And so, when you listen to that and you listen to the arguments behind it, it'd be hard to say that's not right. When you were just talking about, producing the family meal, I'm sitting there thinking about, the love and attention that my wife puts into, a meal when the kids are coming home or whatever, right? It's not like she just says, hey, Tony's is right across the street. Let's just call up the Tony's or whatever. And then you do that. And so we'll come back to that because I want to ask you about symbolism and goods and stuff that you are working on. But before we get to that, I wanted to ask you a question about your work on incentives. Because, one of the standard things, of course, in economics is to say incentives matter. I'm always I kid around with my graduate students because Bill Easterly's book, The Elusive Quest for Growth, was such a crucial book to one of the fields that I'm in, which is comparative economic systems development. And, if you go back and look at that book, he starts every chapter with incentives matter, right? Then he takes a different policies like incentives matter, he goes from there. And your work doesn't deny that, but you delve deeper into actually what incentives are. And I'm not sure if you were here at the time, but I'm always struck by, we had Roland Fryer here to give a talk several years ago. Yeah. And, one of his implications of that were, yes, incentives matter, but incentives are tricky, and that it's not as easy as we thought it was when we laid it out. And that issue of the trickiness relates to the issue of the force with which an incentive hits. So you have this really, really great paper on incentives in the Review of Political Economy. And I just wanted you to elaborate a little bit about that. And if you can, is there, what are the challenges that you say in taking that kind of idea that you develop in that paper and then operationalizing it for students that want to do an applied project, let's say? I'll
just do examples only, so that I hope that inspires some empirical ideas. So the first is about, and we reference this type of work, was what a journalist from the Netherlands started doing after the financial crisis. So he went to the London banks. His name was Joris Luijendijk, but it's a difficult name, but I could send you the link. And so he wanted to understand this bonus culture, right? Because a lot of people were saying, okay, this induces short-termism, and all the short-termism was basically a bad incentive or a pernicious incentive that worked in these banks, and so it helped create this financial crisis. And I think what he came out with was something very different, namely that this banking culture was a competitive culture. And so, as in every competitive culture, there has to be a prize. So you have to get your name up on the scoreboard. And much like, you're always a movie buff, but I think it's Al Pacino and Glenn Ross or so, where he's the ultimate salesman.
Yeah.
right? And there's a scoreboard. So if you make more sales, you move up on the scoreboard. And I think this was his best reading. So, and that's not a reading at all that says, there's a bonus. And so it's the bonus that motivates people to do short-termism. Rather, it's an understanding of the culture in which he says, well, these people wanted to outdo each other.
Yeah.
And yeah, there was also sportsmanship. So when you had won, the party was on you that evening. So in some sense, it was also really about the sport, because the spoils would be divided at the end more or less equally. The status was not divided equally. So there was all sorts of inequality and rankings being created. But right, this is an incentive that looks relatively simple, a monetary incentive. So I think the next work that I really want to highlight people to, and that one of my PhD students here, Blaž Remić, is working on, so he's one of the co-authors on this piece, is intrinsic motivation. And I think all of the literature on intrinsic motivation shows you how tricky incentives are. In fact, a lot of the literature on intrinsic motivation, and for me, this was humble pie, because sometimes where I come from, you are always critical of neoclassical economics.
Yeah.
Holmstrom won the Nobel Prize, and Holmstrom's work is actually all about how tricky incentives are in internal organizations, right? So it starts from the very basic fact that he says, well, most tasks in modern organizations are made up of different dimensions, right? Our job consists of teaching, research, service, and network building, right? And all of these four are very important to our job. And the moment that our organization starts incentivizing something explicitly, we all start to focus on that at the expense of the other ones. And that's actually, the organization ends up worse than it would be otherwise. And the students might suffer because it's not always teaching that's incentivized that way. So here, an incentive that, I think would simply work is it true? And I think this links quite clearly to Roland Freier's work, because you really have to understand what motivates people at 15. And it's not so obvious what motivates people at 15, right? So it might be that they like a game computer, but to come in from the outside and say, well, we're going to give a game computer to whoever 15 might backfire completely, because it might create a dynamic where some people feel that they have no fair chance anyhow, so they just drop out. So the entire incentive backfires. And so I think that, this sort of dynamic is true in very, very many places. And yes, sometimes just studying how complicated the incentive mechanisms that have sort of emerged over time work is very interesting. So a lot of practices that at first look rather odd actually make sense. I think that's the final bit of that paper, is that you can look at, and some of your students have also done this work, right? Look at strange situations where you think this is a habit that doesn't make any sense, and then you can sort of again, humble pie, but think why that institution has remained in place, starting not from the assumption that the institution is silly, but rather that most institutions more or less make sense, or at least made sense 10 years ago. So they might have grown a little bit dysfunctional, but not fully dysfunctional. Otherwise, they would have gotten rid of. And so I think that's what we try to do. And that saying incentives matter is basically only the starting point of research and can never be the end point. The end point requires understanding how people judge a certain situation. And I think in learning, and organizations learn, right? Everybody's engaged in learning all throughout the economy. Setting up incentive schemes might be one of the hardest thing to do. Might also be the part of the job that in a weird way isn't incentivized at all in academia, the learning aspect. So it's interesting to me that Liberty Fund, well, this is an organization you and I both know, they put us back together as students. So they say you do the readings and you sit for 3 days, which suggests that we are under investing in learning. But in many organizations, this is a major problem, right? Because most people are focused in some sense on output of whatever kind. So the learning tends to take a backseat. And so, this work, and there's also in my teaching, we look at sort of how organizations structure that. And to me, that's really fascinating, because again, you basically have to insulate almost. We talked a little bit about this before, but you almost have to insulate parts of the activities and says, well, this day you can only do learning. Yeah. In the Netherlands, you say that you then go to the high. I don't know what the equivalent is. So this is the countryside, and then you have to spend a day with your colleagues just brainstorming. But that captures the insulation, right? Because we would not do it if we weren't sort of forced to do the learning separately. And so this thinking about how you might incentivize that or create institutions that facilitate it, I think, is not at all easy. And so interpretive methods have a lot to contribute there.
One of my surprising articles I read when I was a graduate student is Fritz Machla wrote an article about Jacob Weiner after he passed away, and he describes Weiner's work habits. So Weiner spent every Friday of every week, no one could talk to him, no one could do anything. He was in the library and he just read the journals and he took these notes. And since the journals weren't as immense as they are today, he was able to go from A to Z in the journals in a quarter of a year, and then be able to start with A to Z again for the next quarter. But that's what he did every Friday. No one could interrupt him. No one could do anything like that. And he built that kind of framework in that for his constant learning about what was going on. And since he was reading across the social sciences and the humanities A to Z, it also meant that he was processing fresh stuff all the time, And so it's kind of fascinating to study how individuals in our business that we learn from develop strategies so that they don't get overwhelmed, by the world. And so they're able to do that. I mean, that's, and what incentive do they have to do that? Right? Their incentive to do that is all intrinsic. It's not,
Yeah. So that's indeed with the intrinsic ones, right? So this is one of the things we do quite a bit in teaching, because we have all these students who are going to work with artists or who are artists themselves, right? And so there's a dual question. One is about self-management, and it's actually true that some of the romanticism about the arts, according to the best literature that we read, or at least that I find most convincing, actually says that this is a form of self-management. So the total dedication and the I do it for myself might not be purely intrinsic. It might also have a symbolic element in the sense that it's really worth it. And so the people at the top also tend to reinforce it, that this is science or this is art and it's really worth giving your everything for. It might also have exploitative elements to it, right? Because there's a lot of unpaid internship and hardship before you really become part of the circle. But this aura might have a sort of function. In the sense that it's the only thing that can inspire the type of work that's required to do it well.
This, the world doesn't necessarily know it, but my son, Matthew, he has a little record store now in New York that he owns with a friend of his. But, it took a long time for him to get into that. And he worked as in various places doing a lot of free things to people to build art studios and things like that. And when he finally got the record store going, and we were talking one time on the phone, my wife and I and him, and he said that he had an intern. And I started laughing. I was like, you have an intern? And it was a kid that was at NYU that wanted to work in the arts or whatever. And I said, what do you pay him with? And he says, we give him he can pick, some of the stuff, the pieces or whatever, when they come in or whatever, these kind of things. And I'm like, oh my God, so it was it was all barter economy basically, but it's part of that world. And that kid that was his intern is now has his own art little world that he's going into and everything. So it is a kind of world in and of itself that I think is kind of amazing. You raise a question which I wanted to is about symbolism in goods. So just to give you a context of this, the class is reading Viviana Zelzer economic lives. So the symbolic use of money or the pricing of the priceless and all those things are things that they're interacting with. But it's also the case that about 2 years ago, I was at the conference at Northwestern to vet the Acemoglu Johnson new book, Acemoglu Robinson new book, and on the narrow pathway or the narrow corridor.
Yeah.
And we went to dinner the night, Saturday night, and the provost from University of Chicago was there. And he turns to us as we were just about ready to start eating, our salad or whatever, dinner. And he says, what cultural practice that is accepted today will be viewed as abhorrent in 10 years? What one will be viewed as abhorrent in 20 years, like that. And, like he's a very commanding sort of person. So he felt he could like point you out and put you on, and, eating meat, smoking cigarettes, these kind of things or whatever. And those, because the symbolism of those could shift over time. Right. And so, I've been thinking about this ever since that dinner, meeting, that like, wow, like things really can change and they can change rapidly. And if you think about the current COVID situation, social mores are shifting. Yeah. And which ones will shift like that and which ones will shift back or which ones will persist has to be a question that social scientists are going to have to explore and answer. And you're thinking about some of these things. Maybe you can talk about some of that work of yours, but also just very quickly going back to the incentive issue, you've written a paper on book awards and what role book awards play. Maybe as an entree into this, you could, because one of the things that shocked me when I was a young scholar, the idea of publishing a book with Cambridge or Oxford was like this unbelievably, like, wow, I made it if I achieved that. And then Tyler Cowen came upon me, sometime when we were doing it. And he says, you made it when you certify the publisher rather than the publisher certifying you. Yeah. Right? So when you really made it, what matters is that switch. And like, I never thought about that before, right? Like, what the hell is he talking about? Like, if Oxford's publishing my book, I made it, not that Oxford's thrilled because they're publishing me. But then when you think about it, all of a sudden it makes sense. So, yeah. And same thing with awards and stuff. So do we certify the awards or the awards certify us?
Yeah. No, so yeah, there's lots of sides to that, but I want to tackle one question because it's the one that's on my mind most, and it started from the standard Akerlof story about information asymmetries on the market, right? So according to this information asymmetry story, I think there are two basic solutions. Namely, you would have relatively uniform standards of quality on markets, because that would facilitate it. And this is also what he sort of implicitly at least suggests. There's going to be warranties and sort of lower level guarantees that this product is at least functional. But these are very ineffective in the arts. So you don't want to know that the theater company only has certified artists or people who went to theater school or something of the sort. You want to know that they're excellent. So in the arts, you have lots of quality standards that are far harder to specify completely, but that nonetheless are very important for the functioning of this market and for the coordination taking place there. And I think at the time when I did the book awards paper, and I've moved away from it since, is that I wanted to understand how these different markets deal with these quality norms differently. Right. And so we first did one on film awards, and in film awards, it's actually, if you look at it, a relatively uniform standard of quality. So there is a segmented market. This is important to note, but for the commercial movies, more or less the awards juries all give the prizes to the same people. So if you think about it as a sort of informational device, it makes a lot of sense. right? The experts point to roughly the same thing, not always the same thing, but they have multiple awards to give out also for Best Actor and Best Supporting Actor. So they can sort of signal about 10 movies that they think are worthwhile this year. That's different already if you look for the art house movies, because every film festival wants to award its own movie. If you've already won an award at another festival, then you're almost out of the game. And so we demonstrated that this is true for the book market, which demonstrates there that it's apparently much more important to be distinct than to live up to some uniform standard of quality. So having your own authentic voice or being unique and truly representing something new or novel or distinct is perhaps the best term for it, is much more important. And so when you look at these awards, they always go to different books. I think we found one book in France that won 2 awards over a 50-year period span. So this is really a long time and lots of years in which they can be given the same prize. It never happens. And so that tells you something about the governing quality norms. And Jason Potts, we both know him, immediately said, so we need more book awards. And indeed, we need more book awards, but we don't need more movie awards, because they would simply be going to more of the same. And here they would be sort of representing distinctive qualities for more books. And of course you can have that, right? The best female author, best book that came out of Africa. I mean, you can just keep on imagining awards that all award some distinct quality that is different.
Let me ask you a question real quick on that, because I don't know if you've been following, but like Sandel has a new book out against meritocracy, and there's the president of Argentina just said we have to abolish meritocracy. But I often think they don't really mean abolish meritocracy, but they mean changing what we count as merit. And it's fascinating because I wonder whether or not the examples that they draw are more like the movie awards and less like book awards. And if they were more like book awards, we would say there's a diversity of our understanding of meritocracy, and that's great, right? Rather than the idea that there's only one size fits all notion of meritocracy. Do you think that's right, or am I misunderstanding their criticism?
No, this is precisely, I use the metaphor of mountains and hills. So I think a lot of people think of quality as one big peak, one big mountain, the Mount Everest. And so there's a ranking all the way down. And you want to have a hilly landscape. So, and all the hills represent some distinct quality, right? So one represents the best science fiction movie out there. One represents the best sort of atmospheric movie of the David Lynch type. One represents, and in my own work, I have a paper that's currently under review in which we study exemplary directors. And we argue that all these directors sort of are basically one hill that also new directors can all aspire to. So they can try to be the new Hitchcock, but they can also try to be the new Spielberg, and they can also try to be the new sort of French artistic director. Francois Truffaut is the most named one out of all of them. But so that represents a very, very varied landscape. I think I did a stupid coding exercise for the descriptions that the New York Review of Books does for its back. So it has a sort of translation catalog of forgotten classics. It used over 800 titles and authors that it invoked as markers of quality. So apparently this literature landscape is incredibly rich with competing notions of quality. And sometimes this doesn't happen. And I think that actually often has something to do with an institutionalization that goes wrong in a bad way. So I think universities suffer from this, right? So we talked about this before. So I think we're more or less on the same page, but everybody tries to be number 50 on this one world list. Whereas of course, we want them to be the number one liberal arts college. We want them to be the number one medical science or and then even within that, a specific approach. We don't all want them to be generic universities that all strive to be on this Mount Everest list somewhere between 1 and 50. That creates uniformity. And this goes back to the story of incentives, I think.
And also I think to Ario's point about the neoliberalism. In my view, is that the failure of neoliberalism that people that are critics like Quinn or others, miss, they are much more like there's a diversity of ways in which people can interact. And so the liberal archipelago doesn't have a one size fits all. Even if you take an extreme libertarian presentation like in Nozick, when you get to the final chapters of Nozick, it's about a radical pluralism of lifestyles or whatever. It's experiments in living. There's an old book by Steve Macedo called Liberal Virtues, and he argues about liberalism as a smorgasbord of life experiences that you can select in and out of. It's not just this cookie cutter one size fits all, which is summarized in like the Washington Consensus. So the idea that the Washington Consensus sums up the nature of what we all thought was the way to go, I think is not quite right. That's why I say it's weird for me, because I stand inside of it and I don't see myself in the criticism. So it's now that might just be because I'm afraid to be criticized, right? Or something, but I just don't see it really. And, but I do see it on the others. I wanted to just mention a very interesting episode at HES. Stefan was there. I'm not sure if you were there at the meetings, but it was in New York 2 years ago. And Quinn had given a talk, and then Susan Howson gave a talk. And in Susan Howson's talk, she was criticizing Quinn's talk because she wanted to claim that the architects of the post-World War II economic era were not Hayek and Friedman or whatever, but instead Keynes and, James Mead and these people. And she was very proud of what they had done. And to me, I think she's right, that that's actually who the architects were. And, one of the architects is actually your topic that you're working on at the moment. Yeah. And so maybe we can just flow into that, which is you go from the Austrians into Jan Tinbergen. Tinbergen is the first winner of the Nobel Prize in economics, right? Samuelson's the second, I think that's right? Yeah. And so, you're writing the book on him now, and he was an architect of the world order, right? So yeah.
So I'm currently, the book is with the printer, so there's nothing I can do about it anymore. I'm translating
congratulations.
Thanks. So I'm translating my own book into Dutch, which is a weird, alienating experience about my own writing. But other than that, so it's an intellectual biography of Jan Tinbergen, who indeed is mostly famous in economics for his econometric models of the 1930s, and then later for so-called policy models, which allow you to manipulate the economy as a sort of complex machine, and you have certain knobs that you can turn, which he calls instrument variables, and then you can use them to achieve certain target variables. So it's a very, very much an engineering approach to economics. Now, I do think that, to me, he's still fascinating in a number of ways, and not so much for the econometrics. He was very much an idealist all the way from the very beginning. So that's also how I position him in the book. I start with a discussion of the building of the Peace Palace, and that actually speaks to this internationalist spirit. So, that the Peace Palace in The Hague sort of leads into the League of Nations that's later built, and where he does a major study, and then, but very constrained. We now know that he wanted to publish a lot more than he could say, but at the time the League of Nations could only offer so-called technical advice. And so later he became very much an outspoken proponent of a truly internationalist order. So for example, in the post-World War era, when Europe tried to integrate and unite, he was very skeptical of the whole undertaking, because he said, well, it just means you're going to build walls around Europe, and it's going to come at the expense of emerging economies like India and Brazil and so on. And it's just going to be a sort of a safe haven for the wealthy already at the expense of others. And so there's that side. He was also a fascinating thinker about what he called the race between technology and education. Which is still highly relevant today, in the sense that automation and the effects that has on especially the lower end of the workforce is still a major challenge, and he pioneered a lot of the models in that direction. Jim Heckman is a great fan of that. He did a wonderful retrospective piece on that, so that links up well. But I'm again also really trying to show how environment matters, right? Tyler Cowen on his blog occasionally has this phrase, every thinker is a local thinker. But I really tried to make him emerge out of The Hague, which is a small government city, much like Geneva, of an open trading economy. And I tried to, again, demonstrate how that shapes his outlook on life. I did a wonderful course again. Every now and then, you really have to go to the humanities people to learn from them. And they made us read a biography of Thoreau. Thoreau, is that how you pronounce it? The American poet.
Yeah.
And there, Thoreau emerged out of the woods, out of the environmental surroundings almost. So it was a wonderful first chapter. I hope that I can get anywhere close, that sort of thinking. But so I tried to show that. And he was, Samuelson called Tinbergen a noble saint or something of the sort. So he had imbued this socialism at a young age. It was called cultural socialism at the time, and it meant pursuing a certain lifestyle. Perhaps there's some of that in Arjo, actually, that it has to, your ideology is part of almost every decision you make, who you are. And so it's a very much an identity way of thinking about that. And so that meant all sorts of consequences, that he never had a car and he couldn't afford luxuries. Yeah, he's sometimes reminiscent of the Quakers. So, and he also felt attracted to the Quakers. He spent a year at Haverford. I hope to go there. I'm now in contact with the people there, because it's such an interesting connection between the sides. So again, I try to really show him as a full individual. And
yeah, that's amazing. And so that project is now completed. When will it be out, and with who, and all of that?
They promised me mid-June of next year. So I hope that that succeeds, with Cambridge University Press again. And then I also have a book on the knowledge commons coming out. That's an edited volume, and there we really show sort of pools of knowledge and how important they are in enabling market exchanges. So two last questions. I'm very cognizant that I'm taking up a lot of your time, and it's late in the day, and so you're supposed to be relaxing or going up to a hill to contemplate, since you're in Europe. By the way, when I was in Rotterdam with you, when Ariel kept on telling me about American consumerism, and then I get in. I screwed up and I couldn't figure out how to take the metro rail to get to the airport. So I ended up by getting a cab, which cost me an arm and a leg. But the cab driver had the radio on, and they were just releasing the amount of consumer debt that was in the Dutch, population. And I wanted to tell the guy, turn me around. I want to talk to Ario about this. But anyway, so you teach courses to artists, musicians, painters, whatever, and also people that are going to go into that business. Yeah.
And yet you also bring to them a socioeconomic kind of perspective or whatever. And so as I explained to you some of the things our kids are reading in this class, what kind of literature do you think we're missing here that you would, point to as rich veins of research and learning that we could draw on to help improve our understanding of socioeconomics?
Yeah, so there's one book which to me was really an eye-opener, and the book has flaws, but it's in conversation with economics very, very deeply. So I think in that sense, it's a very good book. It's by Lucien Carpic. It's called Valuing the Unique. It's the economics of singularities. And so he picks up on, his economic discussion picks up on the early discussions over monopolistic competition and how we think about product differentiation.
Yeah.
And he develops that into the modern service economy of, say, legal services or financial services that are completely personalized, but also into the market of wines. He's French, so he wants to say something about the enormous variety on markets. And in that book, he developed something that he calls judgment devices. And he says these judgment devices are almost the most important cognitive structure, the most important coordinating mechanisms of on markets. And so, he actually sides with Akerlof. I don't know whether he's on the side of Akerlof or not, but to me, that is really in sort of economic sociology, the way I teach it, is a key reference. This idea of judgment devices and the rich variety of judgment devices and how that allows for a kind of quality coordination to take place on these markets. Jens Dekker is another author who really emphasized the sort of deep uncertainty underlying these modern markets and how, Hayek marveled, but I think we should get that some of that sense of marvel back, in the sense that these are really, every product is different. So in some sense, price coordination is not what happens here, right? In a very real sense, I always tell my students, there is no price coordination in cultural markets. Every movie that is released goes at the same price at the movie theater. The movie theater doesn't tell you, take this one for a discount. There used to be B films, which were a mild example of that. But this is true also for books. New books that come out all go at the same rate. So there's a different type of quality coordination going on there. And I think, Jens Dekker, we use his volume, The Worth of Goods, quite a bit, but all those chapters speak to it.
When Howard the Duck was released, it went the same price as, E.T. or whatever, right? That's great. I mean, actually, I think that's now just a question on this. When you read this, is most of the empirical side ethnographies, case studies, statistical? I mean, how do they go about unearthing the stuff that they're pursuing?
Yeah, a lot of it does tend toward the ethnographic, although I think the judgment devices has a strong institutional side to it. So basically, they think in terms of market types or coordination regimes as a sort of institutional structure that governs certain markets. And that their analysis also looks that way. It looks the way it would look in the Journal of Institutional Economics, is that you say, well, this is one side of governing things. And I want to plug one paper that my co-author Pavel Kuchar wrote on the economics of selling babies, or as we now call it, renting wombs. And this is a paper on surrogate motherhood. And if you want to talk about changing meanings of goods and how that also facilitates market exchange or hampers market exchange, right? It goes both ways, because meanings of goods can work both ways, and they move in and out of being accepted. I always think child actors are another interesting example. Child labor is wrong, but child actors are, of course, necessary for the creative industries. But his paper really demonstrates how certain people have convinced that this is a service that you're providing to women who can't have babies otherwise. And so this is not an instance of selling babies, but this is an instance of renting a womb from somebody else, and you're providing a service. And then, of course, also the payment has to be justified. So this is the one thing we didn't really touch upon. But I think the other thing that I learned from sociologists always is that everywhere in society, people have to justify their acts. You always have to justify, and you do so by appealing to moral norms that govern somewhere, right? And sometimes you do so opportunistically, but those norms are never fully without consequence. One of the most interesting papers or op-ed pieces that I read upon the Friedman anniversary was the fact that Friedman actually made a moral argument when he said the only purpose of business is to pursue a profit. So he said businesses can justify their acts by saying we do this to maximize profit. They don't always have to rely on some other type of justification. But of course, we know that businesses rely on lots of other justifications as well, right? They are green, they're socially aware, they don't use child labor, and so all these actors are engaged in acts of justification, and then that's an important other aspect of the social economy.
We just had a very fascinating. I don't know if in Europe you had the same thing, but on Netflix, they released this film with the child dancers or whatever. And at first everyone was paying attention, and then there was outrage against it. And, the directors were trying to justify that the reason why they did it was to actually expose the very thing that people are. Anyway, and now when I go to my Netflix thing and I look down, it's not even on the list, of like trending movies or anything. And so I think there's so many fascinating interaction effects between our utility scales and social approbation, social disapprobation, and how that then impacts the way that we view these things, that we have a very thin notion of what goes on if we don't take these into account, these factors. And,
but the example you give also highlights one other aspect, right? What are we consuming when we see that documentary? Are we contributing to that conversation? Are we making that conversation richer, or are we consuming the series or the film? I think this was a film, or
it was a film.
Yeah. But so that's not at all obvious, right? So that's what Arjo always made me do. Like, don't always look at the good. Look at what other things are being produced with that good. And that in part was here a social cause, or perhaps it was the rallying call of the Christian conservative side, right? That tried to mobilize its base through this symbolic good, but don't always look merely at the box offices to understand what's going on.
So, Erwin, one last question, which is just, you take it wherever you want here. I mean, I greatly, all these things are so rich with research agendas. Economists are trained not to do ethnographies, but yet ethnographies are so rich. So, pushing in that direction, I think, is really important. But you have a lot of work in progress as well. So you finished the Tinbergen project. You've been involved. You have your finger in a lot of different projects. What most excites you about the work that's coming next?
There's one thing we have under development that is not yet a paper, but is this general idea that I want to study gray zones. So gray zones are sites where exchanges or social activities happen that really shouldn't happen, but where we close an eye. Now, if you come from the Netherlands, this is fairly obvious because Amsterdam is one big gray zone, right? And the entire world is attracted to come to Amsterdam because it's a gray zone, because you can smoke marijuana. Apparently now there's more states in the United States that also allow for it. But for a long time, that was part of its selling thing. And of course, there was a red light district that was very prominent. And so this is a gray zone. You didn't see those markets elsewhere in society. But I think this happens much, much more than we're aware of, that there are zones in the economy. Free ports are a purely economic example. But there are all sorts of areas where we allow certain things to happen. And when the experiment goes wrong, we also sometimes in the end shut them down. But sometimes the experiment sort of succeeds. So it's a commune or another type of experiment. And then the thing catches on. And then the practice actually becomes accepted. So it's a sort of, you could say a kind of institutional entrepreneurship, in that what happens in those gray zones can be very important for promoting social change. And so the argument would be that, again, society benefits from this pluralism, right? And this pluralism is in part facilitated by having sort of insulated or separate zones in which certain things are allowed that you cannot do elsewhere. And so we give a bit more leeway. We're watching. It's in our blind corner of our eyes, but we keep a small watch on it, so it cannot blow up too much. It can also not grow too big, right? Silk Road, I think, was another interesting example that you might think of as such a market. If it would have remained small, then it would have remained acceptable. So there's also an internal dynamic within these gray zones, that there's self-governing communities that make sure that the practice is not too visible or not too harmful to outsiders, because then they know it will instantly be shut down, right? So an illegal dance party also has all sorts of these elements. Like it can happen, but you shouldn't attract too many people, because then there's crowds outside, and the police will notice and they will shut it down, and so on and so forth.
I know that a fascinating thing on that is the meaning and understanding of corruption. And how a gray zone shifts. So if you think about life under Brezhnev, right? It was generally accepted. And then you have, Gorbachev come in, and then eventually Yeltsin, and you start having shifts to a more above ground economy. And now all of a sudden bribing and whatnot is actually the thing that causes all the problems. So, what constitutes as gray shifts so much depending on the historical context. It's kind of fascinating.
Yeah.
So, it's a great topic.
Yeah. So, David Stark, that's perhaps one author I should also mention. He's a great organizational scholar, and his book, A Sense of Dissonance, also has a study of one of these firms under Soviet times, in which during the evening they were doing the really interesting stuff. So, indeed, a sort of example where this, sort of going against the rules was ultimately socially beneficial. But indeed, right, it can also be the other way around, right? It can be practices that for a long time really should have been condemned, and that we turned a blind eye to because they were part of culture. I think, in some sense, that's what fascinates people about American capitalism, right? Is that it's always has had these sort of rough edges. The current Italian economy is also full of it, right? In ways that are sometimes good, but they're sometimes also truly corrupting and sort of eating out, parasitical on the
real economy. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you very much. I greatly appreciate your time, and you gave us a lot of food for thought. And so, good luck with all of your work.
Thank you for listening to the Hayek Program podcast. To learn more about the research, scholars, and work of the Hayek Program, visit hayek.mercatus.org. For more information about graduate student fellowship opportunities for students at Mason as well as at universities across the globe, please visit students.mercatus.org. We hope you recommend students to our programs or consider applying yourself.